Hi Frans.
Greg, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again too. How are you doing today?
Worried about race in South Africa.
Okay.
It seems every time you think it's calming down, it escalates out of control. The latest one is the Ashwin Willemse incident on TV. We still don't know what happened, but you can speculate. But the one take on it might be this whole pressure that is brought to bear by, call it the quota system, the affirmative action system, which makes it, on the one hand, possible for white people to suspect that black people are not quite up to the mark, and on the other hand makes it possible for black people to feel sensitive, as if they fear that although they worked very hard to get where they got to, that is either truly the result of a quota system or affirmative action, or it is in fact what other people think, and particularly white people, and so the circle continues.
Right.
And yes, it's one of the things which just keeps on puzzling me, is how does one break out of that cycle? As you know, I start my chapter on race in the book with this stereotypical South African situation of which everyone who is white and everyone who is black probably knows in some form or fashion, and that is you come out of the supermarket with your, and if I say you, I mean you as the white person, with your parcels and your goodies that you bought, luxuries and so on. And at the street corner there's a guy who supposedly directs the parking, and he tells you that everything is fine, and he's now supposedly looked after your car, and there's that moment of almost a little buzz of stress. You realize, well, here we are again now. I'm white, I'm privileged, I've got all the stuff, and there's no doubt that is so.
Yeah.
And he's there, and he's black, and he's poor, and he has a bad preparation for life. He just, the cards that he has been dealt are just bad.
Right.
He's an apartheid victim. He didn't go to school. And you say to yourself, now what? I'm supposed to give him some money, or what about tomorrow? Is he going to be here again? And if I give him money, what's he going to do with the money? And what's going to happen to him? And is it going to help? And you go around and around, and there's just this tiny little microcosm of misery that plays itself out.
Yeah.
And again and again and again, thousands and thousands of cases of what I call drip-fed misery, of this low-level racial tension.
Yeah.
That keeps on. And I have no doubt that on the other side it is 10 times worse.
Yeah.
And I say, and I know so many people are saying, isn't there some way we can just magically escape out of this? And I'm not sure there is, but we confronted with the situation we have, and we want to try and find a way.
So Frans, I just want to quickly give an introduction for anyone new to this series. Frans and I are very much we are making a series of videos dedicated to Frans's new book, South Africa Can Work, and this is the second one in that series. And in this episode we plan on exploring the first chapter of your book, which is titled the Amazing Race, which dips into issues of racism, white privilege in South Africa. And so yeah, that's just a bit of insight into where we're going with this video, and what this book actually is. For anyone wondering what this is Frans's book. So Frans, I thought the title of the first chapter was quite interesting. The Amazing Race.
Yes.
Or is it Our Amazing Race? Our Amazing
I think
Race?
it's Our Amazing Race, yeah.
Yeah, Our Amazing Race. I
Yes.
thought that was quite an interesting title. Do you want to just kick it off?
Well, obviously there's a play, a word play, as I like to do, just to get the juices flowing a little bit. On the one hand, there's the race, as in the way we use it in South Africa, the races. But there's also the other sense of a race, which very much features. And what I say is that life is not fair, because when we started the race in this country between the races, the white people were already ahead in the race. That is neither fair nor pleasant, but it's true.
Right.
And there's a wonderful book by, I think it's Jared Diamond.
Is it Guns, Germs?
Guns. Yeah,
Guns, Germs and Steel.
Guns, Germs and Steel, which is quite well known, but it opened my eyes to the origins of racial privilege in the world. It made me realize that what happened was the black people moved. I say black people because there were only black people in those days.
You could just say humans.
Humans moved. Humans moved from Africa, from the center of Africa, gradually migrating northward, and eventually managed whatever the continents looked like then to get themselves into what is now known as probably Iran, Mesopotamia, and in that valley which the Bible talks about, which was very fertile. They happened to figure out, by more luck than anything else, how to cultivate grains and all these fruits and vegetables and so on.
Right.
And at the same time also, or a similar time frame, to domesticate animals. And those were extremely important because they meant that they had stockpiles of food. And because they had stockpiles of food, they had leisure time, and because they had that, they could sit and figure things out for themselves.
Right.
And eventually the wheel developed, and gunpowder developed, and fire, and all these wonderful things which we now take for granted, and which developed into technology and ships and guns and so on. And eventually those were the, and steel, those were the beginnings of the I hesitate to call it civilization of the West, but
sort of modern civilization.
Modern, yes, but all those technologies and scientific discoveries which eventually came on the back of that made what we now know as Europe and the West. Those people then, as we know, conquered Africa and the rest of the world. And we had our notorious colonization, race conflict, and so on. And when they arrived in the Cape, and that's really the point I'm making, is if I say we, the white people were ahead in the race through no real doing on their part, but partly luck and partly the hard work of ancestors, but so it is.
Yeah. I often find that's something of an elephant in the room in the conversation. That even before the Europeans arrived, there was incredible levels of inequality. I mean, why do you think that's a relevant point to make? Because you make that quite early on in this first chapter.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to make because it sort of muddies the water of a nice symmetrical reparation argument. It makes it really difficult then to come and say, well, let's just restore the position to what it would have been in the absence of colonization and discrimination. It sounds so logical and obvious, but how do you actually do that? It's an extremely difficult thing to achieve because you don't know, and that's a fundamental difficulty. I make the point, I use the metaphor that we muddled through by breaking a lot of eggs in order to make the omelette that is now South Africa. And what the affirmative action advocates say to us is we must now unscramble that omelette and go back to the situation, not only what it was when we arrived here in the Cape, but then projecting forward to what hypothetically the situation would have been like in the absence of all this colonization and discrimination. And that's frankly impossible. It's absolutely speculative. So that's one factor.
And there's an absurdity to that sort of thinking because at least from my perspective, because what people seem to be doing there is almost they're projecting an incredibly privileged and sophisticated modern view of the world onto people, onto a period in time that they cannot possibly understand, that hundreds of years ago, and they're imagining what it would be like starting now, but then. So with the tools we have now, but then, and I find that to be such my brain gets confused. It's very difficult to understand what people mean.
It's an incredibly difficult mental exercise to undertake. To say, well, you'll have to have the tools and the language of modern politically correct thinking projected back 350 years or 400 years and say, well, this is what Jan van Riebeeck would have said. Would have said we shouldn't have discrimination in our schools. We'll tax the local citizens and we'll build schools for all the races and everybody will be integrated in the schools. The schools will be demographically representative. Can you imagine Jan van Riebeeck or Simon van der Stel saying something like that? So that exercise is difficult, but as a thought experiment, it makes for interesting thinking, because that then forces you to take the next step and to say, well, let's just suppose for a moment we could have done that. Then let's follow the logical sequence through, and we come to this picture where we say, well...
So you mean sort of an ideal scenario?
Yeah, the ideal scenario. No discrimination, a nice liberal society. Everybody gets the same...
Basically a utopian scenario.
Yeah, where everybody got the same opportunities. And then you sit with this difficulty. Well, all the black people would have gone to school with the white people, and within a generation or so, they would have started catching up. They would have become more privileged.
Sorry, I know we've just said that this is all theoretical, but I just have to say again, it's all in theory. So I just need to sort of.
It's an absolute hypothesis.
I mean, even to talk about it, I mean, I'm nodding and sort of in agreement, but I can't help but think to myself,
but
wow,
at the very least,
it's so speculative. It's just,
But even those who advocate, well, both I suppose, who advocate for and against it, will have to concede that in that scenario, it being so ideal, black people would have advanced far more quickly. So they would have become landowners and professional people and teachers and transport business owners and farmers and so on. So they would have been economically powerful, which would have meant also that you would have had a black workforce, which would have been very educated and trained, and which would have been able to work in all the other factories, including the businesses of the white people. And what is far more important perhaps than that is that you would have had a market of educated and wealthy people, which would have been 5 times bigger, for argument's sake, than what they had. So white people who, as we started out by saying, were already ahead in the race, would have been able to use all of that market and that trained workforce to advance their economic interests even faster.
Right.
So you see how complicated the comparison becomes, and that's the difficulty that befuddles the mind after a while. You suddenly start realizing that it is impossible to unscramble this egg.
I think what also makes so on one hand I think that there's that theory that not only would black people have advanced, but they would have made white people much wealthier. So there's one scenario, but there's also an interesting. I think there's another theory which we've seen in this new movie Black Panther, which is this idea that there could have been a sort of a thriving, very advanced uniquely African civilization had African people had the means to kind of determine their own destiny without European influence.
Yes.
And again, I find that is also so complicated because it's so speculative. And I mean, what do you make of that side as well?
Well, of course, it's possible. The difficulty that we have is we have to deal with reality as we find it now.
Right.
We can speculate about that as much as we like, and we can also speculate about the actual theories that exist about Monomotapa and civilizations like Atlantis and all of these things. Fact is, they don't exist at the moment.
Right.
Does it help us to speculate about these things, and it doesn't seem to take it further. Fact of the matter is, we are how we are. We're sitting with this terribly complicated mixed omelette at the moment, and we must sort of figure out the best way to get forward from here to where we want to be. And that, I think, that is an important question.
Right.
What is it that we want to achieve?
The reason I brought up that this idea of a sort of advanced, uniquely African civilization that we sort of saw in Black Panther, I see that ideal as being a sort of driving force in people that reject a lot of what they consider to be Eurocentric ideas or Western ideas, white ideas, and so that was why I brought that up.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a spanner in the works of people trying to figure out solutions. I mean, would you agree with that? That it features in the rejection.
I hate to use the hackneyed expression because I used a metaphor in another context just now, and that is, do we want to reinvent the wheel?
Yeah,
that's perhaps where it comes from. And let me give you an analogy which I have a little bit of knowledge of, and that is the experience of my own people, the Afrikaner people. We were behind in the race at some point. We were considerably behind in the race in the beginning of the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th century after the Anglo-Boer War. Now, what do we do with that? What did we do with that? And what we did was, there was an element of political power. We used political power to some extent. We at least ensured that there was a very good schooling system in place and so on. And we borrowed heavily. We should have absolutely no illusion about that. We borrowed heavily from the Dutch and the English colonial systems. We used the court system, we used the school system basically, we used all the institutions of business that we borrowed from them.
Right.
We made use of scientific knowledge that came to us from Europe. So all of those things were adapted, but we developed in the same process the Afrikaans language to master those things, and we developed. So what I'm saying is there's no point in reinventing the wheel. You must take what you can and make the best of it. It happens all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as if Afrikaners wanted to create their own unique version of schooling or their own unique version of a legal system. They were happy to concede that people had already figured it out, and they were going to. There
were some adaptations. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
South Africa in itself has a unique Roman Dutch legal heritage, for example, with huge infusions of English law. But they were also indigenous influences, and so it was adapted.
Right.
But you didn't. The good parts were not just rejected, and so to say, well, we're going to try and start over.
Right.
That is just fantasy. There's no basis on which one can work like that realistically.
Do you know where I saw the most extreme? I mean, it's not like I've traveled extensively all over the world, so maybe there are other great examples. But I spent a year in Japan, and I was just so overwhelmed by how the Japanese are incredible. What they do so well is they've invented a whole bunch of stuff themselves, but the things that they've brought over from the West, they've somehow been able to sort of improve on those things in the most remarkable ways, and they do it unashamedly,
Yes.
and they're happy to for people to develop ideas elsewhere, bring them over, and then improve on them.
Yes.
I mean, it's something of a frustration for me that I mean, it's a far more sensitive issue in Africa that people seem to. That people, particularly, I'm in my experience in the younger community, at universities, whatever, people are very sensitive about the origin of ideas and the color of people's skin, the color of the inventor's skin, and so it seems to me that we're making life very complicated for ourselves, because we could save ourselves so much time.
Oh yes, and of course, in reality, it is not as if black people are rejecting American and English culture.
That's another elephant in the room.
It's not true. Most black parents demand English education for their children. Most black parents embrace, if they can, Western style, if you like, businesses.
Right.
They buy from them, they want to work for them, they send their children to school to learn to work in them. So it's just ridiculous to suggest, not to mention the cultural aspects, the music and the clothes and the movies. So it's a sport. I mean, there's not a football follower in South Africa who doesn't know the European and the English leagues off by heart.
Right.
So it's a ridiculous notion to suggest, and it's a political trick, I think, which is bandied about. There's no reality in it. People actually absorb so-called Western institutions all the time. It's only, and where the problem comes in is with situations like this incident, the Ashwell Willemse incident, or the Penny Sparrow incident, or something like that. When that raw racial conflict happens, then all these anti-colonial arguments are, and it's normally the politicians and the intellectuals and the Facebook literati and so on. Who drive those processes. I don't think ordinary black people in South Africa really think that way. By and large, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, if I think of the most radical example of this, it would have to be that that Science Must Fall video, which went viral and blew up, and I agree with you, even though it's certainly probably not representative of most black people in the country. It's still concerning for me as a young South African to think that there's a strain of thought like that operate, sort of making its way through universities. This idea that we should reject everything and start again.
I think that we must still, even though that happens, we must understand, or try and understand, and it's really difficult. It's really difficult to understand where it comes from. But my sense of it is that we all have racial prejudice in our minds, and we let it show. There is that element. It never ever goes away. It is a factor, and my personal thinking is that it is fundamentally rooted in where we started when I said this amazing race.
Right.
And at this stage, there's still another way of putting the same thing is to say, you can say that white people are still ahead in the race by and large, not in each individual respect, but there's white, call it white privilege if you like. It's
Right.
a thing.
Yeah.
It's real.
Yeah.
We must not for a moment think it is not so.
Right.
But what we mean when we say that, what we really mean fundamentally is economic power, and that breaks down into a lot of things. It can be possessions, land ownership, education, fundamental, because education is really economic power, not land. Economic power sits in education, and networks. You know, other white people who have things,
Yeah.
and who can support you.
Yeah.
We always the stereotype is always the ethnic communities in America, like the Jews, who support each other.
Yeah.
Which some will say is good and some will say is bad, but it's a fact of life.
It's effective life. Yeah.
That network. Now, same thing to some extent happens in the white community. People have means and they support each other,
Right.
so that they can also have means, and so it goes. It's just the way the world works,
Right.
and so it's a real thing. And
Yeah.
that exclusion, that sense of exclusion, it's really hard. It's
Yeah.
really hard to imagine what it is like, and I will not even begin to try.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will not, because I know it's there. There is definitely that sense of it as well.
Yeah. So Frans, we've looked at this chapter starts with the story of the relationship that you have with what you call this like low level misery. What did you say?
Yeah, the low level drip feeding
Yeah.
of misery.
Yeah, that you
where we just have that slight buzz of stress
Yeah.
that goes through our society whenever we encounter people of other races. It's not a major thing. It's never a major thing. It's always just a little bit of treading on eggs.
But your point is,
walking carefully a little bit.
but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you stress as well that it's particularly felt when it's not just someone of another race in this country, but someone who's clearly impoverished, someone who's really struggling.
Well, it is obviously slightly different. Of course, there are slightly different dynamics that come into play when it's a more privileged black person, because that also has a difficulty inbuilt in it.
So I just want to. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting you. I just know how sensitive this is. So I can imagine I'm sort of trying to listen to us as if I was a viewer at home, and I guess what some people might hear what you're saying and think, well, I'm not prejudiced, and I think I just want to make a point in support of you that and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you are making quite a sort of brave, and you're sort of being quite vulnerable and brave about admitting that this is a harsh reality of being South African.
It is a harsh reality.
That whether you are well-intentioned, whether you are a genuine racist, it doesn't matter. There is this issue of prejudice that's sort of a part of our country, part of the DNA.
It permeates your thinking. You know, there are two kinds of racism. The one is the overt one. Classic example is two people standing around the braai fire and they make jokes. They make racist jokes.
Right.
Or the other one, which is also overt, is you go to work and someone has to be picked for a job or a promotion, and the white guy gets the promotion, the black guy doesn't. Obvious, and they equally qualified.
Right.
Obvious discrimination. It's not what I'm talking about, because we have now been trained to behave properly. And in a way that's almost more dangerous, because what we do is we then sublimate the real underlying prejudice, because it becomes this very nice formal behavior. We treat each other so fairly in terms of the formal criteria that it becomes more difficult to track and trace the underlying prejudice. So that's there, and I think we all have it. All right, I guess the point is this.
Mm.
We all have subjective racial prejudice, and I'm not alone there. I'm in very good scientific company. There's a very good American writer who makes it, I assume it's a woman by the name of Daisy Gruel. Let me not let my prejudice show,
Yeah.
my bias, my stereotypes, who said that when you make scientific tests, you show people videos of situations in which they have to make instantaneous and instinctive decisions. And the one person in the video is black and the other one is white, and there's a choice to be made, which is not a conscious choice, it's an instinctive choice. The instinctive choices very often reveal subjective prejudices, and they are true for the most correct political thinkers. They're true of lawyers who specialize in equality. They still have racial prejudice because it is subjective and instinctive. And that is why I say, we're almost dead in the water if we're going to try and solve the problem at that level by simply working on our thoughts. It is not intentional, it is subjective, but it's real and it's hurtful. I use the example of, when you cross the road and the light is green, your experience tells you, green light, safe, go. Whereas your experience says, red light, not safe, don't go. And you will be right, I wouldn't say 99%, 99.9% you will be right in thinking it's safe to cross on green. By the same token, if you have a society where, sad to say, for every one person in jail who is white, 60 people are black. People don't think in the scientific way and say, well, there was discrimination and colonialism for 350 years, so there's poverty. Poverty leads to breakdown in households and leads to crime. Therefore, more black people are likely to be involved in crime. Besides the fact, of course, that there are more black people. But quite apart from that, 5.5 times the number of white people are, for every individual on a person-to-person basis, are likely to be in jail. So the average white person doesn't think, but we must now consider all these reasons why this is so. And it's apartheid, and people don't think like that. They simply look at the beach on Durban Beach and they jump to a conclusion and say, well, this is just how black people are. This is generalization from an experience.
I mean, it happens both ways as well. I mean, from all sides. I mean, we're making assessments of people based on our experiences, not necessarily scientific data.
That's really the point I'm making. It's experience. So that is why I say the analogy of the robot is absolutely correct if you are simply looking at everyday life, how you lead your life. That's just the way people respond.
Right.
But people, and to use a nice South African pun, people are not robots. They are not artificially intelligent beings with no emotions. They get hurt. And that's where the nub of the problem sits, because we actually hurt people. If you walk on the sidewalk, and I experienced in New York, and I felt so ashamed, but it happened. I walked on the sidewalk in close to Harlem, so you already feel, well, the reputation says this is a dangerous neighborhood. And 3 ordinary black guys were coming from the front. And I looked up and I started moving out of the way. And they responded. They laughed and they jeered. And I was ashamed. Got to say, I was ashamed. But that is the reality in which I found myself. I responded involuntarily.
Right.
And you can't translate that into scientific thinking in real life. It's really difficult.
Yeah.
And I had been grappling with that problem and that set of problems my entire life as an adult.
Right.
You know, and it still fails me. So I'm asking myself why, and the only thing I can think of is our experience. And it's not only real life experience, but it's mainly, I think, the media. You know, we read about all these things in the media.
Yeah.
So it's really tough. And the point you made earlier about it cuts both ways. Every time I do that, I walk across the street to avoid the confrontation with a potentially black criminal. I send a message of hurt. It happens all the time. So that never stops. Every time somebody flaunts his big car or his house or his kid's performance in school, and the black person realizes, well, I just don't have those opportunities, and it's your face is rubbed in it. It rankles. It must.
Yeah.
You're reminded on a continuous basis of your disadvantage. So that is. So I think yes. I must conclude, and the best I can do is to say it's experience, because if it is experience, then there's something that we can change. It's not the simplest thing in the world, but if you see, I always think we start at the wrong end. We always want to tune people's minds.
Yeah.
All these.
Yeah.
You know, you have these sensitivity workshops, and you have these psychological treatments, and you have all these wonderful approaches.
It's so interesting that you said that, because I was talking to a friend recently, and we were just talking about the kinds of people that you want to be that you want to spend time with, and I said to him that the people I'm in my mid-20s now, still self-actualizing a great deal, doing a lot of thinking about how I want to spend my time, etc. And I said to him, I'm realizing more and more and more, particularly having emerged out of studies and whatever, where people are quite a radical stage of their lives, that I'd rather spend time with people whose thoughts are based on what they experience. I don't want to spend time with people whose experience is based on their thoughts. And I think it speaks directly to what you're saying, because in South Africa I get that sense a lot, that people and I see it in my community at least. I see it online a great deal, but even in everyday life and odd interactions, there's a sense that people sort of project their idea, what they think, onto their experience. And I think it's a tragedy, because we miss the nuances of what's actually happening, and we don't allow ourselves to be. We're not open to what's actually unfolding before us, which I often think is a lot more positive than people make it out to be.
Yeah. No, I'm a firm believer, because up to now what you and I have discussed sounds terribly negative, but I don't think it's just negative. There are two dimensions to this. The first one that I go into quite a bit is I looked back into my own experience, and I asked myself, what has been more valuable in my development? And I like to think there has been some development. And I tell the story of how I grew up in a very conservative, well, a relatively conservative white household in the 60s and the 70s, when apartheid ruled, and I was in a white school, and I literally did not know black people who were not domestic workers, gardeners, shop assistants, and not even behind the counter, but among the shelves, and the odd waiter in a restaurant. Those were the black people I knew. The rest were faceless beings who walked the streets. And
so that was your experience.
That was my experience, and I honestly didn't believe. Now listen, I was then in my first year and second year in university, and I had been exposed, and theoretically I was master of all this non-racial thinking, non-discrimination thinking. I believed strongly on an intellectual level that all the races are equal and everybody has equally endowed with intelligence and genetic skills and so on. But when I confronted myself in that deepest little corner of my personal self, I didn't really believe it. And I couldn't make myself believe it. I actually didn't believe it. And I had an opportunity to do a debate for the university when I was in my second year, I think, second or third year.
Yeah.
At the Grahamstown Festival, I seem to recall it. Somebody said to me it's a different occasion. It doesn't matter. Inter-university debating competition, and I happened to confront the University of Zululand. And there was a fellow from the University of the North, as it was then called, the Turfloop campus, by the name of Mohali Molachi. And I bumped into him in the hallways. We started talking, the way these things happen at these student occasions. And I told him, and of all things, what I had to defend was the former Terrorism Act. Now that was a terrible thing. Terrorism Act basically enabled the government to lock up people for weeks without, and black people in particular, for what was called terrorist activities, which were really part of the struggle against apartheid. And so for black people, that was almost the pinnacle of oppression at that stage.
Right.
I had to defend that as a good thing. Now you can imagine. So I start talking to this guy, and
for the sake of the debate.
The sake, it wasn't my view, but it was a topic. You get given a topic, and I had to pick I had to get the other side. It's just the luck of the draw. And that's particularly significant because Mohali was, first of all, a person who could speak to me on an intellectual level. My equal. Second thing which I realized, and it was the most liberating experience of my life, is he wasn't afraid of me. Do you know how liberating that was? He wasn't afraid of me. He didn't stand back a step because I was white. And I will never forget the sense of gratitude, of liberation, that this guy stands up to me, and he's, you know, when you play sport and the other person never hits the ball back because they're too afraid they might hurt you, or, you know, it's like that. Or you wrestle against somebody but there's no resistance. It's terrible. Here suddenly I was up against a real person, solid. And I so appreciated that. It was a unique experience. And of course he helped me prepare. Listen to this. He was dispassionate enough not to be personally involved in the argument. He could help me prepare this terrorism argument, even though everything in his being would have been against that. But he did the intellectual exercise with me.
There's this really there's a really wonderful quote that I heard yesterday in a debate that I watched, which was about political correctness, which I actually think is quite relevant considering this conversation. But the quote went something like this: Angels are able to fly because they take themselves quite lightly, or they take themselves very lightly.
Yes.
And it was the quote came from Stephen Fry, and his point was that angels, that people are able to sort of soar on an intellectual level when they don't take themselves too seriously, and they're able to sort of. He said, what did he said? He also brought up something about the Oxford manner, which relates to sort of gracefully playing with ideas, you know, and sorry, I guess my point is that's what it sounds like this guy was doing. He was sort of like an angel who takes themselves lightly and is able to fly. He was kind of able to to remove his ego from the equation and deal with you on quite an intellectual level.
And it taught me such a lesson of not only dispassionate intellectual thinking, but as I say, the most important lesson was this dual realization of it's people exist who are black and are intellectually capable. Thank goodness this theory has been vindicated. Secondly, because once you experience it, your life is different. You never ever feel the same about this. It's not solving the problem, but it's a major stride.
I think it's important to emphasize just how profound that must have been for you, because today young people take so much for granted, but back then it really must have been quite.
It was an actual realization, and as I say, at that stage, I had been working through these things. I was master of the theory. I could tell you anything. You couldn't argue with me. I was your best old anti-apartheid advocate ever.
Right.
But deep down, there was that niggle of doubt that was there. Now I laugh at it. I think, but could it be? And yes, it was.
And I mean, and you were someone, of course, who was obviously astute and intelligent and thinking. And I mean, who knows how many more negative experiences there were with people who weren't as awake to those possibilities of black people being able to be equals.
Yes. And I think there's something to be said for that. We mustn't have any illusions about how isolated so many of white people, on the one hand, are of black people, and also how the overwhelming experience of white people is still not a pleasant and a positive one. It is a desperately sad outcome of the economic history of this country.
Right.
That's the problem.
So that's I think that's a really interesting point, because that's the tone of that point, which is quite negative, and is something that I have felt particularly amongst my friends. There's this I find often conversations tend to end almost on that note, and it's very difficult to move past that.
Yes.
So my question to you is, and I think this is good for the chapter going forward, but is how do we? It's all good and well to acknowledge that there were these injustices, that life is harsh, that things are unfair, and you and me can sit here and acknowledge that white privilege is real and that it's terrible and that it But my question is, what do we do tomorrow in the morning when we have to wake up and go back to work? And it's Sunday today. The week's going to start again, and the whole country has to kind of pick itself up and keep going. How do we make something? What kind of lesson can we take? And how can we move forward productively and successfully?
Well, my personal view is that it's not a quick fix. But the biggest quick fix, the closest we'll get to a quick fix, is on the systemic or the structural level. I don't believe that we will fix this by talking. I actually don't believe we'll ever solve the problem by talking in roundtable conferences, on Facebook, in workshops, in seminars, ever. The only way that will solve this is if we can change the structures that keep the black underprivilege in place. Because as I've discussed earlier in the previous discussion, we said that the travesty is not white privilege, it is black underprivilege. That is what we have to address. You touched on it when you used the metaphor of the cake. The cake has to grow It's not a case of taking slices of cake from the white privilege and handing it to the black privilege. It will never ever work.
And it's not a sustainable game to play. To take from people. I mean, in the long term.
No, it's never because for a number of reasons. One is it's never enough.
Right.
Especially here where we have a tiny minority of white people. So just do the sums. It will never ever work. Plus, more important, it has counterproductive effects. You alienate the very goose that lays the golden eggs, which means that the goose will either lose interest in laying eggs, or more likely the goose will pick up and go and fly to another nest. So it will never ever work. The only way is that we must address the underprivilege, and the only way to do that is to address the structures. We must decide what is it that got us where we are,
right, and
change that structure.
Right. I mean, that's what people mean when they talk about, institutionalized racism or structural racism.
Yes, I think that's very much part of the modern thinking is that, and I buy into that to some extent, because I think it is true. What we do, unfortunately, is we exacerbate that structure. As I said, we have all these advantages which are there. We have schools, and we have networks, and we have capital, and we have, most important, we have knowledge. And these things make you feel superior, make you act superior, in most cases make you economically superior.
Right.
Now, how do you address that? And what we touched on in the earlier discussion was, let's be blunt, has affirmative action worked? No, it hasn't worked. It is spectacularly flopped, because those structures that the government has now put in place over the last few decades in order to address this disparity, those structures have in fact made it worse.
Okay, so a lot of people hearing that might think to themselves, what nonsense. How can you say that something that an idea literally called black economic empowerment, how on earth could that possibly fail? I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here, but how on earth could that fail? It must be good, because it's for black people and they're being empowered. How could that fail?
Yeah. Well, the truth is that whenever you apply that kind of measure, and there are a number of legislative measures that fall in that category. The one is labor law.
Yeah.
The other one is employment equity, which is affirmative action in the workplace. And the other one is black economic empowerment in all its forms, which is really, to summarize crudely, to give shares in businesses to black people through loans or otherwise. Right. Black people would otherwise not have got shares. Now, all of those are designed by necessity to benefit the elite, even the labor law. And the reason I say that is we have 16 million employed people and we have 10 million unemployed people. So the unemployed already, who are the non-elite, if you like, the lower end of the economic scale of the economically active, they already automatically cut out of labor law. Plus, not all workers belong to trade unions. The trade unions take the cream off the top. So by belonging to those structures, especially if you're able to benefit from trade unions, you get the benefit.
Right.
That's one example. So almost half the economically active population are cut out by necessity out of the benefits. And that is unfair, because it means that happens at the expense of the unemployed. As we said earlier, it pushes up the expenses, the cost of labor.
Right.
And the moment you put up the cost of labor, you cause labor to be less in demand, greater unemployment.
Right.
Same applies to affirmative action, but in a slightly different way. Affirmative action, again, is a way of skewing the efficiencies you're always going to appoint the second best or the third best person to the job. Why? Because you have to. That's the job of affirmative action. It's supposedly to rectify the previously disadvantaged position. So the previously disadvantaged person, who by definition has less skills and education, will then get the job. So the productivity of the business is almost guaranteed to suffer as a result of that. And that has happened all over the world. Plus, you're alienating the more skilled portion, who then gets shifted out and possibly goes overseas. That's happened in Malaysia. Is a very, very crude example of where it's
Malaysia.
Malaysia, yeah.
What's happened in
It's one of the
Malaysia?
more, depending on your ideological position, one of the more notorious or famous examples. In Malaysia, they did just that. And they have promoted a large number of Malaysians, while the Chinese were the privileged society. And in the process, over years from the 70s, I think it's 77 when they started, 74 or 77, 1 million Chinese have emigrated from Malaysia. And these are the skilled people, skilled and wealthy people. So their investment is pulled out, and their skills are pulled out. So the result is that although they have less unemployment, they don't have an unemployment problem, they still have a gap. The gap between the two still exists. So the inefficiencies that are built into this affirmative action logic breeds less economic efficiency.
I think those are really fascinating ideas. Just because the sort of politically correct thing to believe is that such policies work. That and I think the sort of knee-jerk reaction from a liberal sort of left-leaning person today in South Africa would be that, well, you think that because there's some sort of racist bit of prejudice going on, and but really it's not that at all. It's very much about it's about data that you've studied. You have evidence to back this up.
Yes, I mean it's not. I think everybody must agree that quite obviously what we have been doing for the last 25 years has not only has not worked, has in fact had the opposite effect.
Right.
Whatever that is. People might have a different view of what it is, but that which we have been doing has spectacularly failed. Now, why do we think that we should do more of what we've been doing? See, that's what I don't. That's where the logic escapes me. It seems to me, then obviously you must do something different.
Right.
Now, there are two schools of thought there. The one is to say, well, we already have a free market. We discussed that. We don't. We have a very unfree market. So the free market is not to blame for this.
Right.
And the other way to go is then to say, well, then perhaps we should have a more free market. And that is obviously where my thinking goes. Because just to come back to the Malaysia example, next door to Malaysia sits Singapore.
Yeah.
Also with large populations of Chinese and large populations of Malaysian people. Singapore did differently, as they didn't have a quota system. They didn't have affirmative action. They simply had market-friendly, free market policies. And needless to say, the gap between the Malaysians and the Chinese disappeared far more quickly than it did in Malaysia.
Wow.
So there is no question. The best way. I gave you a book when you came in by Riley. What is his first name? Mr. Riley is an author with the Wall Street Journal, a journalist, and he wrote a book called "Please Stop Helping Us" from a black person's perspective. As you can gather, he is black.
Yeah. And please stop helping us.
Please stop helping us, and he refers to precisely these things. Affirmative action policies, the whole issue of fair employment policies,
right.
anti-discrimination policies, affirmative action in universities, and every single one conforms to the pattern that the more you artificially assist a portion of the population on the grounds that they were previously disadvantaged, the more you seem to exacerbate the problem that you're trying to address.
What I find so sort of stunning about this point that you're making is that it feels I find it very frustrating, because I've experienced so many negative situations where people clearly haven't had access to this information, or haven't been interested even in this information. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of the discourse seems, whether that's public discourse or the discourse going on at universities, or between people in their 20s still trying to figure out how life works and how the country operates and whatever. It seems like a lot of that discourse lacks. It lacks a connection to evidence, to data, to statistics, to numbers. It's all. I mean, so much of a lot of it tends to be quite anecdotal or very emotional. And again, coming back to the beginning point, some of the points we made earlier about racism and white privilege being issues that hurt people. I mean, it's not like I'm naive or I understand that these are sensitive issues. But it seems to me that if we have any hope in hell of making South Africa work, that we need to at some stage sort of pull our socks up and say, okay, we need to sort this out.
Look, I have no illusions about the mountain that one has to climb, and
right.
You and I can sit here and we can agree, echo chamber each other into oblivion. It will not make an iota of difference. That is why I continuously address the question as to how do you persuade people. And you'll remember where we came in earlier on today when I said to you, the thing that really made a difference in my life on the racism issue was experience. And to me, the same thing will apply to economic change. You will never, ever change people's minds in this country unless you can change their experience. And the experience that I have in mind is if you can find some way of experiencing the benefits of a free market. Because we don't have, you remember the old joke about, I think it was Gandhi, who was asked, what do you think of Western civilization? So he replied, I think it will be a good idea. Now, likewise, what do you think about a free market in South Africa? It would be an excellent idea. Why don't we try it? Someone wrote a book called Legalizing the Free Market.
Oh yeah?
Decriminalizing the free market. Like cannabis. Let's just give it a try. Because we give it a try, even if it's in a township.
Right.
Someone came up with a brilliant idea, a friend of mine, Piaket Lamini, who said, why don't we make it Soweto? Why don't we go to Soweto and create a free market zone where the laws of prohibiting people to contract for labor, prohibiting people to trade their skills, prohibiting people to sell what they want to sell, where they want to sell,
really
for what prices.
So really tiny special economic zones.
A special economic zone in the poorer part of Johannesburg.
Right.
And let's go there and see what happens. Because how bad can it be? The worst that can happen is it won't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think
it will flop. Then we go back to square one. But
back to the drawing board. Yeah.
I know it won't. It will work. Can you imagine if people who have no jobs suddenly find out that there's a place where you can go and you can find a job? Yes, it will be a low wage, but it will be a wage.
Yes.
And I think there are enough people who would be not only keen but enthusiastic to give that a try.
Mm.
And that will set a process in motion, because it never stops there.
Mm.
The history is littered with examples. My best example is Taiwan, where they started, their process of industrialization, basically allowing the market to do what it does best.
Yeah.
In a low-level labor law, almost non-existent labor law environment. And their annual increase of income in the manufacturing industry, for example, averaged about 88% in real terms, not inflation-based terms, real terms.
Wow.
Now, that is just spectacular. I mean, we could dream of that. And with full employment.
Yeah.
Full employment all the time, as in 2% unemployment or something.
What comes to mind is this sort of this will sound very sort of random, but it's central to this point. So I've come across this guy called Ido Portal, who's an Israeli guy, and he's created this thing called movement culture, right? And the whole philosophy behind movement culture is to sort of get people to rediscover movement on their own terms. So to basically let go of reps, sets, times, all that stuff, and restrictions.
We're talking exercise.
We're talking exercise, but
training,
it's linked.
Whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's linked to this, right? So his philosophy is let go of the restrictions that come with sets, time, reps, and all that stuff, and stop worrying about yoga and boxing, the names that come. Just
move.
Just move. Just move like an idiot if you must, but just move and sweat and like you're a kid again. And it's taking off, he ended up training Conor McGregor. It's really kind of picked up.
Yes.
And I'm trying to do some of that myself. Anyway, the beauty of movement culture is that it reconnects people to their bodies, to movement in a very kind of primal way. And I can't help but think that what the free market sort of does, and what these special economic zones have the potential to do, is reconnect people in quite a primal way to entrepreneurship and to their ability to make something and then be rewarded for it. And yes. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, because what you do is you enhance the number of choices. And I think that's part of what works with the exercise example, is that you have so many more choices to solve your problem. And
you don't need, and also in the exercise example again, there's nothing necessarily to validate me besides my own body. So it's like if you want to work for 15 hours a day or 20 hours a day, there's no government interference. You get to determine that for yourself.
Yes. I think there's something to be said for it, and there's also at a very deep level psychological basis, I believe that we crave that freedom. I know there are different kinds of personalities. There's some personalities who just want to have a set of rules, but that doesn't matter. The market will always create rules for people who want to be employees with rules.
Right.
But for the entrepreneurial type who likes the risk taking, there's nothing more thrilling than the freedom to be able to choose. It's also scary, but there's a huge number of people who love that ability to create something out of the uncertainty that the free market presents. And that is how we go forward.
And of course, when you say entrepreneurial, you're not just referring to entrepreneurial on a sort of a Facebook scale. You're talking about even on the smaller scale.
Tiny. I think some people will have a fruit stall, and some people will have a welding shop. I have spoken about my experience of Uganda, but it was amazing the scale of the number of enterprises, different kinds of enterprises that were served by people who could. If you think of the number of jobs that can be done on a small scale, one-man band type of basis.
Yeah.
There's almost no limit.
Yeah.
There were fruit stalls, yes, and there were curio shops, yes, but there were people who made gates for construction sites. There were
Right.
people who made bricks. There were people who worked on cars. There were people who did hairdressing. The people who looked after other people's pets.
Right.
And so on. And it just carries on. People who obviously made food. So that the examples just pile up. Transport, of course, is a famous example. And what you do is you learn to identify needs and you respond to those needs. And there's this thrill of, I'm actually doing something which people need.
Right.
So I'm very much in favour of that.
So Frans, bringing this back to race before we wrap up. How does race what kind of threat to our progress does our preoccupation with race pose?
Look, it's a major preoccupation. The question is how we respond to it.
And by the way, I when I say preoccupation, it's not like I'm undermining the.
It's important.
It's important.
It's important, but at the same time, it's really important to decide how we respond to it. I think that's the and fundamentally, in the end, it can only come. I think it can only come through our leadership and our government, which will help us to create the freedom where these things start mattering less rather than more. Because as long as we think we can address the preoccupation, we will enhance the preoccupation. That is the counterproductive effect. Just as addressing economic disparities by way of affirmative action makes the disparities worse, just so continually scratching that wound, that scab of racist hurt will make it worse. Because what happens is you put people in an arena where they continuously talk about this stuff and they eventually start fighting. I honestly don't believe you can workshop your way out of it.
Right.
What we have is, what we want is, I mean, I have the old hackneyed expression, some of my best friends are Jews, some of my best friends are blacks. But I have one or two black friends who are economically privileged and to whom it never ever occurs that race is an excuse for anything that happens.
Right.
They make me feel like Mohali Malachi way back when made me feel. They make me feel comfortable. Because somewhere along the line the penny dropped that ultimately nobody is going to make me advance other than me.
Well, I think
that is such a relief for both parties when that happens.
That's such a powerful point, I think, because I was just thinking as you were speaking, I was thinking about how when in South Africa, you know, I find a terrible thing that I see quite often is sort of oversimplification, and I feel that the problem with oversimplifying the issue of race is that we miss out on exploring we miss out on the very important job of exploring other variables or factors, which is what you're kind of referring to, the issues of personal responsibility, issues of things like teen pregnancy or education levels, not exclusively race. And I guess I'm often dismayed at sort of how oversimplified the discussions become, or when in fact they're so complex actually, and we don't do ourselves any justice
Yeah.
I mean, would you agree? Or?
Yeah, I do agree on one level, but I also don't want to, if I can use a perverted term, overcomplify it. I do think it's important that we cut the Gordian knot by way of something, and that something to me is creating an environment where people's maximum potential is exploited. We have to find a way, because if you cut through all the nonsense, ultimately it comes down to this economic chasm, which is partly a material chasm and partly an educational one.
Right.
All of which underlies, I believe, fundamentally underlies this clash. I come back to the example of the prison population, but there's also, for example, how it's reflected in the news. If you read a story in the newspaper and there was a murder, if it's a white person who committed the murder, it's news. It's on the front page. Why? Because it is news. It is rare.
Statistically,
it's relatively rare. It doesn't mean white people are better. There are terrible white people who are in fact murderers, but it's news because it's not so common. Same thing in education. The chances of somebody passing matric today, this is a shocking statistic, are plus minus 4 times better if you're white.
Wow. Yeah.
4 times. Now, that must leave an impression. How can it not leave an impression? Can you imagine if we lived in a society where everybody had the same, more or less the same income, more or less the same cars, houses, schools, education? Could you imagine that we still have all of this prejudice? No. I find it really difficult, because I know from personal experience that once you move into that environment, my kids, when we moved to Cape Town, we moved into a school where the majority of the kids were not white. After, I don't know how long it was, very, very short time, you forgot about that. That was just how it was. Yeah. That was just the way in which we lived. Yeah. And that's how the world became. And it suddenly became normal for black kids to be part of the sports teams that perform, part of the academic performance, the guys who got the prizes for mathematics. And
well, I mean, a good example of this is, I went to high school, obviously, with Daniel, with your son, and a lot of the students who went to our high school were Muslim, and so our experiences of Islam were very positive. And so, over the years, as sort of issues of Islamophobia have become, quite prominent in the news, I've always kind of in the background thought to myself, I feel quite privileged to have had this very positive experience, because I can always I can take that information with a pinch of salt, because our experience of Muslim people, because of our high school, it was always positive. And that just goes to show, it just proves your point that at the end of the day, it's about our experiences, and not about what necessarily we think. Or
so that's maybe where we should go with this. Just one more story I tell in the book is one which everybody experienced, but I just want to remind people of sports in this country. When it was about 2 years ago, I think, the English toured South Africa, and there was newly elected Themba Bavuma and Kagiso Rabada, and of course then not so newly elected Hashim Amla. And Hashim Amla batted extremely well, because we were going to lose the test and they had to save the test, and it was Hashim Amla and Themba Bavuma, and they had to save the test for South Africa. And Hashim Amla batted very well, and Themba Bavuma made his first century for South Africa. And that was an extremely emotional occasion. I'll never forget it. It was at Newlands, and the way he jumped in the air when he got that 100, and the entire crowd, and it was a big crowd, just rose like one and applauded him. And then when he came off, the mostly white players were lining up at the end of the day's play and sort of applauded him off the field. And I thought to myself, does it require the performances of a black player like that to make us become non-racist, or will it even have an impact to that effect? No, it won't. But at least it shows white spectators that a black person can play at that level, and that's something which normal people understand. At that level. Plus, you have the experience of black people seeing that white people revere players of that level, that international experience level, as exceptional. And they become their heroes. Kagiso Rabada, who took 13 wickets in the next test. Now, I mean, he's now the best bowler in the world.
It's amazing.
Surely that must have some impact. I made a point on Facebook at the time, and I said Kagiso Rabada is making more of a contribution towards fighting racial prejudice in this country than the entire ANC. Not a popular statement amongst the ANC, but a lot of people agreed with me. Because I believe that experience is what got us into this jam. And it's only experience that will get us out of it.
If I can bring this back to that example you used, the metaphor you used of the traffic lights, it seems to me like what a lot of people in this country are trying to do is force people to go when it's green and stop when it's red, despite the fact that every now and then, actually quite often, a car goes through a red robot, and it seems to me like the problem isn't that people aren't stopping at the lights. It's the problem is that people are going through the red lights, and so the question is, how can we decrease the number of accidents happening instead of worrying about what people think about the robots?
No. We'll just have to change the experience. There is no way that we will ever solve the puzzle by talking. I actually think the more people talk about it, the more they become incentivized to take up adversarial positions. I don't know if that makes sense, but when I experienced this, let me just diverge for a second, is in labour law. I actually thought that labour law, which was precisely that, it was that sort of traffic light scenario. We are going to tell you how to behave in the workplace. We are going to create workplace peace, industrial peace, cooperation. And what it meant was, as I said, every time I walked out of court or out of the arbitrations, I said to myself, I had another divorce today, in a manner of speaking. And it suddenly dawned on me that it becomes like a little boxing ring in which you set people up as adversaries. And now they have to slug it out. And that boxing ring had a counterproductive effect. Whereas, because there's no question that labour relations, forget about race relations, labour relations have deteriorated in this country beyond belief under the fine ministrations, tender ministrations of labour law. It has not moved forward so much. And the worst part is, and if you measure it by way of cooperation, 10 million people are no longer cooperating
Mm.
in the venture that is labour. That has to be a movement backwards. Quite apart from that, the strike rates go up. They stay high.
Mm.
So, and our productivity is terrible. It's not working. So
Right.
back to the counterintuitive thing.
Mm.
You think you can make a law to make things better. It's almost always going to have the opposite effect.
Wow. I mean, I think that's a great note for us to kind of wrap up on. I think my last word would just be something along the lines of that this issue of race. I almost feel like we need to have another conversation. I almost feel like there needs to be a part 2 for this chapter, because it really is. I mean, I still have more questions that I'd like to ask you, and yeah, I think my feeling now is that it's complicated, and then and it takes time to kind of talk these issues through and make sense of what's going on. So for anyone watching, I think that's something that I'd like to emphasize.
I would like to end off with this, and it's a repeat, but it's a reminder. When the Institute of Race Relations asked people, what is your most important problem? What do you identify as the most important problem in South Africa? I think 56% said unemployment. And you know how many people said race?
Yeah, I mean, I've got it 4.7.
4.7%.
Yeah.
So we must address the serious problem. Both unemployment for its own sake, but unemployment as a cause of racism. So both of those.
Well, thank you very much, Frans. Thanks for another great chat, and I look forward to our next conversation, where either we do a part 2 of this chapter, or maybe we move on to the next one.
Sure.
Although I feel like race is bound to sort of emerge in each conversation, regardless of what happens.
It will, because there's one about affirmative action specifically.
Right.
The whole rent-seeking thing is infused. In fact, it never leaves.
Right. Well, anyway, thanks again, Frans.
Right.
And to anyone interested in getting Frans's book, it's available on Takealot, and I can say from experience that it's an incredibly important book that I think all South Africans should not only read once, but should actually keep by their bedside and sort of pick up every now and then to remind themselves how we can move forward and what's really important. Anyway, thanks, Frans.
Good.